Hey everyone, it's Congressman Jamie Raskin calling out to all my friends in Maryland's beautiful 8th Congressional District and beyond, throughout Maryland and throughout the United States, to all of our fans of Local Hero out there. It is my favorite time of the week, Local Hero, when we get to salute and praise and interact with the people who make life in our community so wonderful. And this is National Preparedness Month. And our local hero is Patrick M. Campbell, the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Health and Human Services in Montgomery County, and someone who is just roundly praised by everybody who works with him. He's got over 21 years of experience in government and in not-for-profit organizations serving communities, and he's motivated by a very strong belief that everybody deserves to have security and safety and dignity in their lives. And he makes sure that the government is always working to make that happen. He has served vulnerable populations. He's worked on combating climate change. He's worked on improving public health response. He's worked on assimilating immigrants into the community and planning for and responding to large-scale disasters and emergencies. He's served not just with Montgomery County, but also with the U.S. Coast Guard, the American Red Cross, local government, and tons of different not-for-profits. Patrick, for everything that you've done for our community in all these different capacities, you are a local hero, and congratulations.
Yep. Thank you so much, Congressman. I appreciate it.
Tell us how you got inspired and involved in this line of work, because it seems like no matter what, you keep coming back to public and community service.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for me, really began with my dad. My dad always pushed is how do you make your community better than it was? So I knew right out of high school I was going to go into one of the military branches, and I chose the Coast Guard. And in the Coast Guard, all of a sudden I got introduced to this organization, this idea of emergency management. How do you help people, not just in the rescue part of it, but how do we bring people all the way from rescue all the way through recovery? And so after that, I started exploring emergency management, trying to find ways that I can, make a difference. But along the way, you start to realize that disasters don't hit communities evenly. Sometimes there's economic reasons, vulnerable populations are affected differently. And so I kept just trying to find my niche in it. How do I stand in a position that I can help those who need it most? And I really value the work because it's a place you really feel like you can make a difference. And it's a field that is growing both in its knowledge and its ability to serve the public better. And then you look at failures like Katrina, where, there was parts that went well. And then there's a lot of parts that didn't. And you realize, we can do better and we want to do better.
You bring that kind of 360-degree view to public health emergencies, to climate events, to weather, because you're seeing our communities in a kind of three-dimensional way. And I wonder how being at the Department of Health and Human Services as the deputy COO empowers you to take that broader perspective and view of things.
Yeah, I think one thing that we do that's really well and that I'm most proud of is that from the point that we get called by the fire department to establish a shelter, we're thinking about how do we help these folks recover? How do we take our equity and diversity lens and apply it so that we're serving our population in either their language? How do we bridge barriers? My role is to figure out how we harness our entire department, not just for the initial emergency, but how do we hold their hands, guide them, stand beside them, give them the support they need to actually recover and flourish. And then the second part of it I like is that, really the other part we do in HHS is trying to help build a resilient community, whether it's helping people develop economically, better education, better resources. And so we have this ability to make people more resilient, which means then they could be better prepared. So when a disaster comes, they're not as affected. My dream someday is that I'm out of a job because people are resilient and there are no disasters. I mean, I feel like that's the ultimate dream emergency management, that we make our community so strong they don't need us. It's obviously it would be amazing if we ever got to that point, but it's what you work for, that your community is so resilient, so prepared that you're not the most important role during disaster because your community can help itself.
Well, and we've got a lot to get through before we get to your beautiful dream there in the age of climate change, right? Because we're seeing escalating kinds of calamities, whether it's record drought or record rainfall and flooding, ocean level rise, hurricanes of record velocity, and so on. And it seems to me that in the age of climate change, this is either going to be a period of denial, or it's going to be a period of, as you say, learned resiliency and preparedness, where we're all learning to be more rugged and prepared for what's to come, right?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, in the end, ultimately, what we really need to do as a population is lean in on mitigation. What can we do to stop this from coming? Because repairing from a storm costs vastly more. It costs more in financial resources, lives. We want our community to be resilient, and the way we do that is strong infrastructure. But if we could do something to not put more pressure on old infrastructure, and I just think back to the Twin Brook flood I think we had in 2021, where, it was a flood that affected a building that had been there for decades, never previously had been a problem, but it had so much rain drop so quickly, it overwhelmed road designs that were in code when they were put in. But because of the rain totals being much higher, it created a dangerous event, displaced, 30, 40 families, and then, almost a year's worth of work to get those families, back along. It's caused by the increased rain. And I think sometimes with climate change, sometimes people are caught up on maybe the really big weather patterns, but we have to realize the significant impacts. One of the biggest killers during storms is, these high heat events. It claims a lot of vulnerable populations' lives. Flooding is a big, common thing that's going to pop up. It's not always going to be the dramatic storm. And then these just constant dry heat. When you just look the way it affected our agricultural sectors, even just the trees in our own neighborhoods, how they look because of the increased heat. It's shocking sometimes to see.
Yeah. Well, what advice would you give to a young person who's seeing the world the way that you're seeing it, Patrick, and wants to go into building community prevention and preparedness and resiliency? Do you recommend people going into one of the armed service branches at this point and then working their way back, or going directly into something like the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services? What's your theory on that?
I think sometimes you have to see, where your skill set is. We all have different ways we can make the world better. And it's going to take, people like me who did go into public service. It's going to take, business people who do the right thing. I think we have to realize we all have a role to play. In terms of, whether you go into human services, sometimes if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I didn't know I'd end up in human services. But what happened was I knew I wanted to do emergency management, and then I realized I wanted to do emergency management where I help the most vulnerable populations. And then over time, you realize you have a gift for it. And then there's some people who their gift is doing something, either firefighting, Peace Corps. So I think everybody should find a way to serve. It doesn't necessarily have to be military. You learn a lot. You end up connecting with people who you might not otherwise interface with. And learn. There's a lot of ways it's going to take to solve the future problems. And I always think is when people say, "Oh, this is the most challenging time ever," I was like, "Well, you look back in time, you can always find a time that's harder." But I think what we always have to do is maintain hope that we can all do something. Like the little thing I always do, my family knows if I'm going to visit them, I'm going to check their smoke detectors because I know it's one of the most common things that might affect them and make them dangerous. So they know I'm going to check them. And my father-in-law, they know he's going to hear beeping when I come visit. And then try to gently guide people, because I know family pressure does more than, fly or something like that. And so we can all contribute in a really little way like that, or find a significant way where you invest your entire career into it. But what I would say is if you do go into government, you have to realize it's a difficult place because we're always dealing with competing resources. But I always believe if you work with good intentions, you always put your heart in it, you'll start to convince people that investing money in emergency management, investing money in mitigation and preparedness is money well spent, because it actually in the long run saves us money. And that way we have a community that's taken care of. We don't need to go to a funeral, and we don't see people lost their homes. I've done that so many times, and every time you go to these big events, even as a responder, you lose a little piece of yourself because you hate to see people harmed or in a bad position.
That's Patrick M. Campbell, the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Health and Human Services, our local hero this week as we celebrate and observe National Preparedness Month. Patrick, thank you for everything that you do in our community and for modeling a real ethos of public service.
Yep. Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate it.